when 203 civilians were trapped in a collapsing valley with 0 viable landing zones. Every pilot said it was a suicide mission. Then 24-year-old Eliza Jackson defied direct orders, landed her Black Hawk in a space the size of a tennis court, and proved that sometimes the most unlikely hero is exactly who you need when the impossible becomes the only option. The morning briefing at Ramstein. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Airbase started precisely at 0630, but Flight Lieutenant Eliza Jackson had been awake since 0400. She stood near the maintenance hangar, watching the German sunrise paint the sky in shades of amber and gold, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The base hummed with its familiar rhythm, jet engines spooling up for training flights, ground crews conducting pre-flight inspections, and the constant chatter of radio communications echoing across the tarmac. At 24, Eliza cut a small figure against the massive aircraft that dominated the landscape. Standing barely 5 feet 3 inches and weighing perhaps 125 pounds, she often disappeared entirely when walking between the hulking Black Hawks and transport helicopters. Her fellow pilots had nicknamed her Sparrow behind her back, not out of malice, but because she seemed so delicate compared to the mechanical giants she was trained to fly. Born in Manchester to a family of teachers, Eliza had always been drawn to aviation. While other children played with dolls or video games, she built model helicopters and studied flight manuals. Her parents had worried when she announced her intention to join the Royal Air Force, convinced that their bookish daughter wasn't cut out for military life. Even now, after 2 years of exemplary service, they still asked when she might consider a more suitable career. The European Joint Operations Command had stationed Eliza at Ramstein as part of a multinational rescue and transport unit. On paper, she was fully qualified for all mission types. In practice, she found herself relegated to routine transport runs and equipment transfers, while her male colleagues handled the high-profile rescue operations. Her flight instructor ratings were among the highest in her class. Her mechanical knowledge was encyclopedic, and her precision flying was legendary among the maintenance crews who watched her thread massive aircraft through impossibly tight spaces during training exercises. But when it came to real missions, the ones that mattered, the ones that made careers, Eliza was consistently overlooked. Her commanding officers spoke of her with professional respect, tinged by paternalistic concern. She was technically proficient, but lacks the physical presence for high-stress operations. She was detail-oriented, but might struggle in chaotic situations. The subtext was always the same: too small, too young, too delicate for the serious work. The briefing room buzzed with anticipation as Eliza slipped inside, finding her usual spot near the back. Maps of Central Europe covered the walls, with red zones marking areas of civil unrest and natural disasters. Squadron leader Marcus Thornfield stood at the front, his weathered face bearing the gravity that came with 20 years of military aviation. Eliza opened her notebook, though she suspected she already knew what role she'd be assigned. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thornfield announced, his voice carrying across the assembled pilots and crew, "we've received an urgent humanitarian request from the Alpine Rescue Coordination Center. There's been a massive landslide in the Bavarian Alps. A tourist resort in the Berchtesgaden Valley has been cut off, with approximately 203 civilians trapped." Eliza's pen hovered over her notepad as Thornfield continued. "The terrain is challenging, narrow valleys, unpredictable wind patterns, and extremely limited landing options. The German rescue services have requested our assistance due to the international nature of the tourist group and the technical complexity of the operation." As he began reading crew assignments, Eliza felt the familiar tightness in her chest. "Morrison, you'll lead the primary rescue team in Bird 1. Kowalski, you're his co-pilot. Henderson, you'll take Bird 2 for equipment and supplies. Jang, you're with Henderson as backup pilot. The names continued, each assignment another reminder of where she stood in the hierarchy. The chosen pilots exchanged confident nods and began discussing approach strategies. These were the moments that defined careers, that turned routine service into legend. And once again, Eliza would be watching from the sidelines. Jackson, Thornfield's voice cut through her thoughts. You're on logistics coordination. Monitor communications and track equipment manifests. Make sure we have real-time updates on passenger counts and medical needs. Equipment manifests, again. Eliza nodded professionally, maintaining the composure she'd perfected over months of similar assignments. Around her, the selected crews were already deep in mission planning, their voices animated with the excitement of meaningful work. As the briefing dispersed, she lingered near the tactical display showing the disaster area. The topographical maps revealed a landscape of impossible complexity, knife-edge ridges, box canyons, and landing zones that existed more in theory than practice. But Eliza had studied these mountains extensively. During her off-duty hours, she'd memorized German alpine charts, weather patterns, and emergency protocols. She knew every peak, every valley, every potential approach route within a 200-kilometer radius. Nobody had asked her to do this research. Nobody knew she'd spent countless hours studying scenarios exactly like this one. But Eliza had learned early that being prepared for opportunity was the only way to create it when you were consistently excluded from creating it yourself. The mission briefing continued in the adjacent planning room, where the selected crews huddled around detailed satellite imagery and weather reports. Eliza remained at her assigned station in the communication center, monitoring radio chatter and updating passenger manifests, but her attention kept drifting to the conversations happening 20 feet away. The primary LZ is here, Morrison was saying, pointing to a cleared area on the satellite image. But it's compromised by debris from the landslide. Our backup options are limited, maybe this meadow here, but it's barely large enough for one aircraft at a time. Henderson leaned over the map, frowning. Wind shear through those valleys is going to be brutal. We'll need to time our approaches perfectly to avoid getting caught in downdrafts. What about this area? Kowalski suggested, indicating a small clearing closer to the resort. Looks tight, but it would cut our ground transport time in half. Morrison shook his head immediately. Too risky. That's maybe 40 meters across, surrounded by trees. One wrong move and we'd have more casualties instead of rescuing people. Eliza bit her tongue. She'd studied that exact clearing on previous alpine charts. It wasn't 40 meters, it was 53 meters at its widest point, and the tree line was lower on the eastern approach due to avalanche damage from 3 winters ago. The wind patterns there were actually more stable then. The primary LZ due to the surrounding ridge formations. But voicing these observations would only reinforce her reputation as someone who overstepped her assigned role. The morning progressed with mounting frustration for Eliza, while she coordinated supply manifests and tracked weather updates. Flight crews conducted pre-mission briefings that highlighted exactly why they'd been chosen over her. Morrison had 15 years of mountain rescue experience. Henderson had flown combat missions in Afghanistan's notorious mountain terrain. Jang had specialized training in high-altitude aviation medicine. Their qualifications were impressive and legitimate. But what they didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Eliza had quietly earned her mountain flying certification through civilian channels during leave time. She'd logged hundreds of hours in alpine conditions with German and Swiss rescue services as a volunteer, using her own money and vacation days to gain experience. She hoped might eventually be recognized. The cruel irony was that her extensive preparation made her more qualified for this specific mission than any of the assigned pilots. But military aviation didn't work on quiet competence. It worked on documented experience and command confidence. And nobody had confidence in someone who looked like she should be teaching kindergarten, rather than flying combat rescue missions. During the lunch break, Eliza overheard a conversation that crystallized her predicament. She was updating communications logs when Flight Sergeant Davies approached Morrison near the coffee station. "Hell of a mission profile," Davies commented. 200 civilians trapped in terrain like that. "You sure you've got enough crew for multiple runs?" Morrison stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "It's going to be tight. The weather window is narrow, and we can't afford to overload the aircraft given the landing conditions. Might need to consider weight restrictions." "What about Jackson?" Davies suggested. "She's current on Black Hawk operations. Could serve as backup crew if you need extra hands." Morrison's response was polite but definitive. "Davies, I appreciate the suggestion, but this isn't a training exercise. We're talking about landing in conditions that would challenge experienced mountain pilots. Jackson's a fine logistics coordinator, but that clearing requires someone with the physical strength to muscle a helicopter through unpredictable wind shear. No offense to her capabilities, but physics doesn't care about equal opportunity." Davies nodded, understanding the subtext. "Fair point. Better to go with proven experience for something this critical." Eliza continued updating her logs, her face carefully neutral despite the burning sensation in her chest. She'd heard variations of this conversation dozens of times. Too small to handle turbulent conditions. Too inexperienced for high-stakes missions. Too risky for anything that really mattered. The afternoon brought additional complications that reinforced her exclusion. German weather services updated their forecast, predicting deteriorating conditions by evening. The rescue window was shrinking, adding pressure to an already complex operation. During the updated briefing, Thornfield emphasized the need for absolutely reliable crews. "This is a career-defining mission, people," he announced. "Every pilot assigned to this operation needs to be someone I'd trust with my own family. No room for uncertainty, no room for error." His eyes swept the room, landing briefly on Eliza before moving to the selected crews. The message was clear. This was serious business for serious people. Not experimental assignments for unproven pilots who happened to be technically qualified. As the crews moved into final pre-flight preparations, Eliza retreated to her quarters to review the mission communications protocols. Hidden beneath her regulation manuals was a detailed folder containing her unofficial alpine flying research. Topographical charts marked with wind patterns, landing zone assessments, and emergency approach routes. Weather data going back 5 years for this specific region. Contact information for German mountain rescue coordinators who knew her capabilities but had no influence over military assignments. She'd spent 18 months preparing for exactly this type of mission, hoping her dedication would eventually be recognized. Instead, she was relegated to radio monitoring while others handled the meaningful work. The worst part was understanding their reasoning. In a crisis situation, commanders wanted predictable outcomes from proven performers. Her unofficial qualifications and hidden expertise counted for nothing against their documented experience and physical presence. As the sun reached its zenith outside her window, Eliza made a decision that would change everything. She began gathering her personal flight gear, not the standard equipment she'd been issued, but the specialized mountain flying gear she'd acquired during her civilian training. If an opportunity arose to prove her capabilities, she intended to be ready. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What none of her colleagues knew was that Eliza Jackson had been preparing for exactly this type of mission for over 18 months. While they saw her as an inexperienced logistics coordinator, she had quietly transformed herself into one of the most qualified alpine rescue pilots in Central Europe, all on her own time, using her own resources. Driven by a determination that bordered on obsession, it had started during her first leave period at Ramstein. Instead of returning to Manchester to visit family, Eliza had driven to Innsbruck and enrolled in a civilian mountain flying course with Alpine helicopter services. The instructor, Hans Müller, was a legendary figure in European mountain rescue, a grizzled Austrian who had pulled survivors from impossible locations across the Alps for over 30 years. Flying in mountains is not about power, Müller had told her during her first lesson, watching as she struggled to maintain control in the treacherous downdrafts above the Stubai Valley. It is about understanding the air, reading the landscape, becoming one with the helicopter. Big pilots with big muscles cannot force their way through wind shear. Small pilots with big brains learn to dance with it. Eliza had spent every available weekend and vacation day over the following months returning to Innsbruck, accumulating over 400 hours of specialized mountain flying time. She'd learned to read wind patterns by studying snow plumes on distant peaks, to identify safe landing zones by analyzing slope angles and surface composition, to navigate through valleys where GPS signals failed and weather changed in minutes. Personal flight log, hidden in her quarters, told a story that would have amazed her Ramstein colleagues. She'd landed on glaciers at 3,000 meters altitude, extracted injured climbers from ledges barely wider than her rotor disc, and flown rescue missions in conditions that grounded commercial aviation. Her civilian instructor certifications included high-altitude operations, mountain weather interpretation, and technical rescue coordination. But military aviation operated on official credentials and documented experience. Her extensive civilian training existed in a parallel universe that had no impact on her military assignments. Müller had offered to provide references, but Eliza knew that unsolicited endorsements from civilian instructors would only reinforce perceptions that she was overreaching her assigned role. The preparation went beyond flight skills. Eliza had studied German emergency protocols, memorized radio frequencies for Alpine rescue coordination centers, and established personal relationships with mountain rescue teams across Bavaria and Austria. She spoke fluent German and passable Italian, languages that could prove crucial in coordinating international rescue operations. Her technical knowledge of helicopter modifications for Alpine operations was encyclopedic. She knew which engine settings optimized performance at altitude, how to calculate weight and balance for mountain operations, and which equipment configurations provided the best safety margins in unpredictable conditions. She'd even purchased specialized survival gear and rescue equipment with her own money, keeping it ready in a personal kit that nobody knew existed. The irony was painful. While her assigned colleagues prepared for their mission using standard briefing materials and general mountain flying principles, Eliza possessed detailed knowledge of the specific region where the civilians were trapped. She'd flown practice approaches through those exact valleys, studied the wind patterns around Berchtesgaden, and established communication protocols with the local rescue teams they'd be working with. Her personal charts of the area included notations that could save lives, updraft patterns that could assist heavily loaded takeoffs, alternative approach routes that avoided the worst turbulence, and emergency landing sites that weren't marked on standard military maps. She'd identified 17 potential landing zones within 5 kilometers of the reported disaster site, including 3 that could accommodate a Black Hawk in conditions where the official options became impossible. During quiet moments in the communications center, Eliza would study the incoming weather data and compare it to patterns she'd observed during her civilian training. The official forecast predicted marginal conditions, but her experience suggested windows of opportunity that weren't apparent to pilots unfamiliar with alpine microclimates. She could see solutions that others couldn't imagine, but had no platform to share that knowledge. The personal cost of this preparation had been significant. Instead of building relationships with her military colleagues, She'd spent weekends in foreign countries pursuing training they didn't know about. Instead of participating in base social activities, she dedicated her free time to studying weather patterns and terrain maps. Instead of dating or developing a personal life, she'd invested every available resource in becoming the pilot she knew she could be. Her family thought she was becoming obsessed with her career. Her few friends at Ramstein assumed she was antisocial. What they couldn't understand was that she was driven by a vision of who she could become if given the opportunity to prove herself. Every hour of mountain flying time, every weather pattern memorized, every rescue technique practiced was an investment in a future that others couldn't see. As evening approached and the mission crews completed their final preparations, Eliza reviewed her personal equipment one more time. Specialized navigation tools designed for mountain operations, emergency communication devices that worked in areas where standard military radios failed, survival gear rated for alpine conditions, medical supplies configured for helicopter-based rescue operations. She'd spent over 15,000 euros of her own money and 18 months of her life preparing for a mission that she wasn't allowed to fly. But as she watched the deteriorating weather reports and listened to increasingly concerned communications from the disaster site, Eliza had a growing certainty that her preparation was about to become relevant in ways that nobody could predict. The pattern of exclusion at Ramstein had become so predictable that Eliza could anticipate it weeks in advance. Whenever interesting missions appeared on the assignment board, humanitarian rescues, diplomatic transports, training exercises with elite units, her name would be conspicuously absent from crew selections. Instead, she'd find herself assigned to routine cargo runs, equipment transfers, and administrative support roles that kept her safely away from anything that might test her capabilities. The morning after the Alpine rescue mission was announced, Flight Sergeant Davies approached Eliza at the communications desk. His expression carried the apologetic tone she'd learned to recognize, someone about to explain why she wasn't good enough for meaningful work. "Jackson, I know you were hoping for flight assignment on today's operation," Davies began, consulting his clipboard. "But Squadron Leader Thornfield wants to make sure we have absolutely reliable communication coverage. Your technical expertise with radio systems makes you invaluable in that role. Invaluable in that role." The phrase had become a euphemism for too risky for the real work. Eliza had heard variations of it countless times. She was too valuable as a logistics coordinator to risk on combat missions. Too important in administrative roles to spare for flight operations. Too essential for support functions to include in the assignments that actually mattered. "Of course, Sergeant," Eliza replied professionally. "I'll monitor all frequencies and maintain real-time updates on passenger status." What she didn't say was that she'd already identified 3 critical gaps in their communication planning. The German rescue teams used different radio protocols than the standardized NATO frequencies her colleagues were expecting. The mountain terrain would create dead zones that could be avoided with proper frequency selection and relay positioning. The weather conditions would require backup communication methods that weren't included in their current plan. But offering unsolicited technical advice would only reinforce perceptions that she was overstepping her boundaries. So she remained silent while her colleagues prepared for a mission. Using incomplete information and suboptimal procedures, the exclusion extended beyond formal assignments. During informal discussions about flight techniques and rescue procedures, conversations would stop when Eliza approached. Not out of malice, but because her colleagues assumed she wouldn't understand the technical details they were discussing. They'd include her in general conversation about weather or logistics, but the sophisticated tactical discussions were reserved for real pilots. Lieutenant Chun, one of the few female pilots on base, had tried to include Eliza in flight crew discussions early in her assignment. But after several instances where Eliza's detailed technical knowledge made other pilots uncomfortable, Shun had quietly suggested that she might want to dial back the intensity to avoid alienating her colleagues. "I know you're qualified, Eliza," Shun had explained during a private conversation. "But some of the guys feel threatened when you demonstrate more technical knowledge than they have. Maybe save the detailed analysis for when you're actually assigned to missions." The advice was well-intentioned but devastating. Eliza was being told to hide her competence to make others comfortable with her presence. Her expertise was seen as a social liability rather than a professional asset. So she'd learn to listen silently while others discussed topics she understood better than they did, contributing only when specifically asked and never volunteering information that might challenge their assumptions. The psychological toll was significant. Eliza found herself questioning whether the problem was her colleagues' perceptions or her own abilities. Maybe she was overestimating her qualifications. Maybe her civilian training wasn't as relevant as she believed. Maybe the experienced pilots were right to doubt her readiness for challenging missions. But then she'd review her flight logs and training records, comparing her qualifications to those of pilots who received regular flight assignments, and the evidence was undeniable. She had more mountain flying time than Morrison. Her technical test scores exceeded Henderson's by significant margins. Her emergency procedure certifications were more current than Zhang's. The exclusion became particularly painful during post-mission debriefings. After successful operations, the flight crews would gather in the squadron-ready room to discuss lessons learned and share experiences. Eliza would sit on the periphery, taking notes on communication procedures, while the pilots recounted dramatic moments and technical challenges. "The approach to that LZ was hairier than I expected," Morrison would say. "Wind shear caught me off guard, but I managed to compensate." Eliza would know exactly which wind patterns he was describing and could have predicted the conditions based on her study of that terrain. She could have suggested approach angles that would have minimized the turbulence and landing techniques that would have improved safety margins. But her knowledge was theoretical in their eyes textbook, learning without the credibility of practical experience. The irony was that her practical experience exceeded most of theirs in the specific conditions they'd encountered. But that experience existed in civilian training records that carried no weight in military aviation. Her hundreds of hours in alpine conditions meant nothing compared to their documented military flight time, even though their military experience was primarily in flat terrain and benign weather conditions. During equipment inspections, Eliza would notice configuration errors that could compromise mission safety. Radio frequencies programmed incorrectly for the operating area. Navigation waypoints that would route aircraft through known turbulence zones. Emergency equipment inadequately configured for mountain operations. But pointing out these issues would only confirm her reputation as someone who couldn't stay focused on her assigned responsibilities. So she watched silently as missions launched with preventable problems, knowing that her knowledge could improve safety and effectiveness, but having no acceptable way to share that knowledge. The pattern had repeated so often that she'd stopped feeling surprised by it. Instead, she felt a growing certainty that eventually, the system's refusal to utilize her capabilities would create a situation where lives were at stake and proper expertise was unavailable. As she monitored the final preparations for the Alpine rescue mission, watching her colleagues make decisions based on incomplete understanding of the challenges they'd face, Eliza realized that moment might be approaching sooner than anyone expected. 3 weeks after the Alpine rescue mission, a successful operation that had earned Morrison and his crew commendations while Eliza updated communication logs, whispers began circulating through Ramstein that would fundamentally change her standing within the unit. What had started as professional respect tinged with paternalistic concern had evolved into something far more damaging, suspicion about her true motivations and loyalties. The trouble began during a routine equipment audit when Chief Warrant Officer Reynolds discovered Eliza's personal flight bag in her quarters locker. Standard procedure required notification of any specialized equipment beyond regulation issue, and Reynolds had been conducting random inspections as part of quarterly security protocols. "Jackson, I need you to explain this equipment," Reynolds sighed, spreading the contents of her bag across the briefing room table. Alpine-specific navigation tools, emergency communication devices, specialized survival gear, thousands of euros worth of equipment that far exceeded standard military issue. "Sir, this is personal equipment I acquired during leave time for civilian training," Eliza explained, maintaining her composure despite the growing knot in her stomach. "All items are legally obtained and comply with base regulations for personal gear." Reynolds picked up a high-altitude navigation device that cost more than most junior officers made in a month. "Jackson, this is professional-grade mountain rescue equipment. Why does a logistics coordinator need gear designed for extreme alpine operations?" "I've been pursuing additional flight training during leave periods, sir. The equipment supports those training activities." "What kind of training?" Reynolds's tone carried an edge that suggested this wasn't casual curiosity. Eliza detailed her civilian mountain flying certification, her extensive hours with Alpine helicopter services, her specialized emergency procedures training. With each qualification she listed, Reynolds's expression grew more skeptical rather than impressed. "So you've been conducting unauthorized training with foreign nationals, accumulating flight time that isn't documented in military records, and acquiring specialized equipment for operations outside your assigned role," Reynolds summarized. "Is that accurate?" The way he framed it made her dedication sound like deception, her initiative like insubordination. "Sir, all training was conducted during approved leave time using personal resources. I followed proper notification procedures for foreign travel." "But you didn't notify your chain of command about the nature of this training or your acquisition of specialized equipment." "Sir, I didn't believe civilian recreational activities required specific command notification beyond standard leave." Approval. Reynolds exchanged glances with Squadron Leader Thornfield, who had been listening silently from across the table. The unspoken communication between them suggested this conversation had been planned rather than spontaneous. "Jackson, help me understand something," Thornfield interjected. "You're assigned to logistics and communications, but you're spending significant personal time and money training for mountain rescue operations. You're acquiring equipment for missions you're not assigned to, studying terrain for areas outside your operational responsibility, and developing capabilities that exceed your current role requirements. What exactly are you preparing for?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Eliza realized that her dedication was being reframed as potential insubordination, her preparation as evidence of problematic ambition. "Sir, I believe in being ready for whatever the mission requires. My goal is to maximize my usefulness to the unit by developing capabilities we haven't requested and don't need," Reynolds asked. "Jackson, your job is logistics coordination. We need you focused on that role, not distracted by training for operations you're not qualified to perform." "Sir, with respect, I am qualified to perform mountain rescue operations. My civilian certifications and flight hours demonstrate." "Your civilian certifications are irrelevant to military operations," Thornfield interrupted sharply. "Military aviation requires military qualifications, military experience, and military discipline. This pursuit of unauthorized training suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of your role and responsibilities." Eliza felt the ground shifting beneath her. Her most admirable qualities, dedication, preparation, initiative, were being twisted into character flaws. "Sir, I've never neglected my assigned duties. My performance evaluations have been consistently excellent." "Your performance evaluations reflect your competence in assigned tasks," Thornfield replied. "But this equipment audit raises questions about your focus and judgment. I'm concerned that you're more interested in playing pilot than doing the Job you were assigned. The phrase playing pilot stung like a physical blow. After thousands of hours of legitimate flight training and hundreds of hours of specialized mountain operations, she was being dismissed as someone with unrealistic fantasies about her capabilities. Over the following days, the implications of that conversation rippled through her daily interactions. Her suggestions during briefings were met with polite dismissal rather than consideration. Her technical input was questioned more thoroughly, as if her motives were suspect. Colleagues who had previously treated her with professional respect now seemed to view her with cautious skepticism. The isolation became more pronounced when Captain Williams pulled her aside after a routine briefing. "Jackson, I'm going to give you some friendly advice. Word around the squadron is that you might be trying too hard to get into flight operations. Some people are wondering if you're positioning yourself for assignments you're not ready for. Sir, I'm simply trying to be the best soldier I can be. I understand that, but perception matters. Maybe dial back the extra activities and focus on excelling in your current role. Prove yourself there before reaching for bigger things." The advice was well-intentioned but devastating. She was being told to limit herself, to accept the narrow boundaries others had established for her capabilities. Her preparation was being treated as presumption, her qualifications as problematic ambition. The breaking point came during a squadron safety briefing when Major Collins discussed the importance of staying within assigned roles during emergency situations. His words were general, but his glance toward Eliza made the specific target clear. "We've all seen situations where personnel exceed their authority because they believe they're more qualified than their assigned role suggests," Collins stated. "This kind of freelancing creates chaos and compromises mission effectiveness. Everyone needs to understand their lane and stay in it." Eliza left that briefing understanding that her 18 months of preparation had been reframed as 18 months of problematic behavior. Her dedication had become grounds for suspicion rather than commendation. She was being systematically pushed into an increasingly narrow box, told to limit herself to the minimal expectations others had for her capabilities. That evening, she sat in her quarters staring at her personal flight logs and training certificates. Months of careful preparation, thousands of euros invested, hundreds of hours of specialized training, all of it now viewed as evidence of poor judgment rather than exceptional dedication. But as she reviewed the Alpine weather reports and mission updates from the disaster area, Eliza realized that her preparation might soon become relevant in ways that would override questions about her motivation. The emergency call reached Ramstein at 13:47 hours on what had started as a routine Thursday afternoon. Eliza was updating supply manifests in the logistics center when the priority alert tone echoed across the base, followed immediately by squadron leader Thornfield's voice over the emergency communication system. "All available crews to the command center immediately. We have a mass casualty situation developing in the Bavarian Alps." Eliza dropped her clipboard and ran toward the command center, her heart hammering against her ribs as she joined the stream of personnel converging on the building. The main display showed a satellite overview of the Berchtesgaden region, with a pulsing red indicator marking a location that made her blood turn cold. The Adlerhorst Mountain Resort, situated in one of the most spectacular and dangerous locations in the German Alps, had been partially destroyed by a massive rockslide. The resort's dramatic position, perched on a narrow shelf between towering peaks, had made it a destination for wealthy tourists seeking extreme alpine experiences. Now that same location had become a death trap. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have 203 civilians trapped at the Adlerhorst Resort," Thornfield announced to the assembled personnel. "The access road has been completely destroyed by rockfall, and the primary helicopter landing zone is buried under approximately 50 meters of debris." The scale of the disaster was unprecedented for the region. Eliza studied the tactical display. recognizing the terrain from her extensive civilian flying experience in the area. She'd actually landed at Adlerhorst twice during training exercises with Alpine helicopter services, back when the resort had been cooperating with rescue services on emergency preparedness planning. Initial reports indicate multiple serious injuries, including several casualties requiring immediate medical evacuation, Thornfield continued. German Alpine Rescue has requested full NATO assistance due to the international nature of the tourist group and the technical complexity of the extraction. Major Collins stepped forward to address operational details. The challenge here is access. The resort is surrounded by vertical rock faces on 3 sides, with the only approach valley now blocked by unstable debris. Weather conditions are deteriorating, with high winds and low cloud ceiling expected by 1800 hours. Eliza felt her stomach clench as she processed the tactical situation. This wasn't just a challenging rescue operation. It was approaching the limits of what conventional helicopter operations could accomplish. The terrain features that made Adlerhorst an exciting tourist destination created almost impossible conditions for large-scale evacuation. "Sir, what are our landing zone options?" Morrison asked, already studying approach charts. "That's our primary problem," Collins replied grimly. "The main LZ is gone." German rescue services have identified 2 potential alternatives, but both are marginal at best. The first is a meadow approximately 2 kilometers from the resort, requiring ground transport across unstable terrain. The second is a ridgeline clearing that's barely large enough for single aircraft operations. Henderson raised his hand. "What about approach routes? Any way to get close enough for winch operations?" "Negative. The resort's position on that shelf makes rotor downwash extremely dangerous. Any aircraft attempting to hover near the buildings would risk bringing down additional rockfall or creating dangerous wind effects in such a confined space." As the briefing continued, Eliza realized that her colleagues were facing a scenario that exceeded their operational experience. Mountain rescue in alpine conditions required specialized techniques and intimate knowledge of terrain behavior that wasn't covered in standard military training. The approaches they were discussing would work in open terrain, but the unique characteristics of this disaster site created challenges they weren't recognizing. "Time is critical," Thornfield emphasized. "Initial medical reports indicate that several casualties won't survive overnight in current conditions. We need to establish evacuation operations within the next 4 hours to have any chance of preventing additional fatalities." The room buzzed with urgent planning as crews began coordinating mission assignments. Eliza found herself once again assigned to communications monitoring and logistics support, watching as others prepared for the most challenging rescue operation in the unit's recent history. But this time, the assignment felt different. As she listened to the operational planning, she could identify critical gaps in their understanding of the terrain and conditions. The weather patterns they were anticipating would actually be more severe than predicted due to the unique topography around Adlerhorst. The approach routes they were planning would encounter wind shear that could be avoided with different flight paths. The backup landing zones they'd identified had characteristics that weren't apparent from satellite imagery, but could be managed with proper techniques. During a brief planning pause, Eliza approached Flight Sergeant Davies. "Sergeant, I'm familiar with the Adlerhorst area from previous civilian training. There might be additional landing options that aren't showing up on the standard charts." Davies looked up from his radio equipment checklist. "Jackson, I appreciate the input, but the German rescue services have provided comprehensive LZ analysis. We're working with the best available information." "Sir, I've actually landed in that area multiple times. There's a maintenance area behind the resort buildings that could accommodate a Black Hawk if approached from the northeast. It's not on most charts because it was constructed after the last survey update." "Jackson, this isn't the time for theoretical suggestions. We need proven solutions from experienced mountain pilots. The dismissal was polite, but absolute. Once again, her specific relevant knowledge was being ignored because it came from unauthorized sources. But this time, the consequences of that ignorance would be measured in lives rather than just missed opportunities. As the mission crews moved into final preparation phases, Eliza retreated to the communications center to monitor radio traffic. From the disaster site, the reports coming in were increasingly desperate. Medical personnel at the resort were dealing with injuries beyond their capability to treat. Weather conditions were deteriorating faster than predicted. The conventional rescue approaches being planned were running into exactly the obstacles she'd anticipated. At 15:30 hours, the first German rescue helicopter attempted to reach the resort using the primary approach route. Eliza listened to the radio traffic as the crew encountered severe turbulence and was forced to abort their landing attempt. At 15:45, a second attempt using the alternate approach also failed due to unstable conditions that made safe landing impossible. By 1600 hours, it was becoming clear that conventional rescue operations might not be sufficient to reach the trapped civilians. The window for successful evacuation was closing rapidly, and the approaches that looked feasible on paper were proving impossible in actual conditions. Eliza stared at the tactical display, knowing exactly how to solve the problems that were grounding other aircraft. She'd flown in these specific conditions, understood the terrain behavior, and could execute approaches that others couldn't imagine. But she remained trapped in her communications role, watching as time ran out for 203 people who needed someone willing to attempt the impossible. At 16:15 hours, as the third consecutive rescue attempt was forced to abort due to impossible landing conditions, Eliza made a decision that would change everything. She approached Squadron Leader Thornfield at the command center, her heart pounding, but her voice steady with professional determination. "Sir, I need to speak with you about alternative approach options for the Adlerhorst rescue." Thornfield looked up from the tactical display, his expression showing the strain of watching multiple rescue attempts fail while 203 civilians remain trapped. "Jackson, unless this is about communication protocols, I don't have time for, sir. There's a landing zone that isn't on the charts. A maintenance area constructed behind the resort buildings 3 years ago. I've landed there multiple times during civilian training exercises." The command center fell silent, except for the crackling of radio communications. Every eye turned toward Eliza, most filled with the familiar mixture of skepticism and disbelief she'd grown accustomed to over the past months. Jackson, German. "Alpine Rescue has provided comprehensive intelligence on all available landing zones," Major Collins interjected. "If there was a viable option, they would have identified it. Sir, with respect, this LZ was constructed after their last survey. Update. It's not in official records because it was built as emergency infrastructure for the resort's extreme sports operations. But it exists, and it's accessible." Thornfield studied her carefully, his weathered face showing the calculation of a commander, weighing desperate options. "Even if this landing zone exists, Jackson, you're not qualified for mountain rescue operations. This isn't a training exercise. Sir, I have over 400 hours of certified alpine flying time, including specific experience at this location. I'm qualified for high-altitude operations, technical rescue coordination, and extreme weather flying. My civilian certifications exceed the requirements for this mission profile." The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything her colleagues believed about her capabilities. Morrison stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years' experience. "Thornfield, with all due respect to Jackson's enthusiasm, we're talking about conditions that would challenge the most experienced mountain pilots. The wind shear around Adlerhorst is legendary. The approach angles are completely unforgiving. One mistake and we lose aircraft and crew instead of rescuing civilians. I understand the risk, sir, Eliza replied, her voice gaining strength as she finally had permission to demonstrate her knowledge. But the conventional approaches are failing because they're fighting the terrain instead of working with it. The northeast approach I'm suggesting uses the mountain's own wind patterns to provide lift assistance during the critical landing phase. She moved to the tactical display, pointing to terrain features that her colleagues had overlooked. The key is understanding the Venturi effect created by this ridge formation. Instead of approaching against the wind shear, you use it. The downdrafts that are forcing abort decisions can actually be converted into controlled descent assistance if you understand the timing. Henderson frowned at the display. Jackson, that's pure theory. You can't predict mountain weather patterns with that level of precision. It's not theory, sir. I've flown this exact approach in similar conditions. During my training with Alpine Helicopter Services, we practiced emergency scenarios specifically at Adlerhorst. I know how the wind behaves around those peaks, how the terrain affects rotor performance, and where the safe zones are within the approach corridor. Chief Warrant Officer Reynolds, who had questioned her equipment just weeks earlier, shook his head dismissively. Jackson, civilian training exercises are completely different from actual rescue operations under pressure. You're talking about risking lives based on practice runs. Sir, we're already risking lives. Every minute we delay increases the casualty count. The weather window is closing. Conventional approaches aren't working. And we have 203 people depending on us to find a solution that others say is impossible. Major Collins leaned over the tactical display, studying the approach route Eliza had outlined. Even if your landing zone exists and your approach is feasible, Jackson, you're still talking about an untested pilot attempting the most challenging rescue operation we've seen. The risk assessment is unacceptable. Sir, what's the acceptable risk of watching 203 people die while we debate qualifications? Eliza's voice carried an edge of controlled emotion. I'm not an untested pilot. I have more mountain flying experience than anyone in this room. I know this terrain better than anyone currently available. And I'm offering to prove it when conventional wisdom says it can't be done. The command center erupted in overlapping conversations as officers debated the implications of her proposal. Some dismissed it as desperate thinking from an unqualified pilot. Others acknowledged that conventional options were proving inadequate. A few recognized that extraordinary situations might require extraordinary solutions. Through the chaos of discussion, RADIO reports continued updating the deteriorating situation at Adlerhorst. Medical personnel were running out of supplies to treat serious injuries. Weather conditions were worsening ahead of schedule. The structural integrity of the resort buildings was questionable after the rockslide impact. Thornfield raised his hand for silence, his expression showing the weight of command decision-making under impossible circumstances. Jackson, explain exactly what you're proposing. Specific approach angles, landing procedures, and extraction timeline. For the next 10 minutes, Eliza detailed a rescue plan that demonstrated knowledge her colleagues hadn't imagined she possessed. She explained wind pattern calculations that accounted for seasonal variations in alpine weather. She described landing procedures that minimized rotor wash effects in confined spaces. She outlined extraction protocols that could handle the volume of casualties within the available weather window. Her expertise was undeniable, her preparation thorough, and her confidence absolute. But she was still the small logistics coordinator who had been deemed insufficient for serious flight operations just hours earlier. Jackson, your technical knowledge is impressive, Thornfield finally said. But knowledge and execution are different things. I cannot authorize an unproven pilot to attempt a rescue that experienced mountain flyers consider impossible. Sir, then authorize me to prove I'm not unproven. Give me the chance to demonstrate my capabilities when lives depend on it. The request hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down before the established order. Eliza Jackson, the overlooked logistics specialist, was asking for the opportunity to attempt what no one else had been able to accomplish, and time was running out for 203 people who needed someone willing to try. At 16:45 hours, as Eliza's detailed rescue proposal hung in the air of the command center, Squadron Leader Thornfield faced the kind of decision that defined military careers. Radio reports from Adlerhorst were becoming increasingly desperate. Medical supplies exhausted, structural damage worsening, and weather conditions deteriorating faster than any forecast had predicted. "Jackson, step outside for a moment," Thornfield ordered. "I need to discuss this with my senior staff." Eliza left the command center and waited in the corridor, listening to muffled voices engaged in heated debate. Through the partially open door, she caught fragments of conversation that revealed the impossible position her proposal had created. Completely unprecedented to authorize an unqualified pilot for this level of operation. But if she's right about the landing zone, it might be our only viable option. Career suicide if this goes wrong, and we'll have additional casualties instead of successful rescue. Double quotes. 203 people are going to die if we can't find a solution that works. After 15 minutes that felt like hours, Thornfield called her back inside. His expression carried the weight of command decisions made under impossible circumstances. "Jackson, I cannot authorize you to lead this rescue operation. You lack the documented military experience and command qualifications required for mission leadership, however." He paused, studying her with eyes that seemed to be calculating risks beyond standard military protocols. "I can authorize you to serve as navigator and local terrain specialist for Morrison's crew, provided you can demonstrate your claimed knowledge of the area." It was a compromise that satisfied no one. Morrison would retain command responsibility, while benefiting from her terrain expertise. Eliza would finally get flight assignment, but under circumstances that limited her authority to implement the solutions she knew were necessary. "Sir, with respect, navigator position won't be sufficient," Eliza replied carefully. "The approach I'm describing requires pilot-level decision-making and aircraft control. Split-second timing adjustments that can't be communicated quickly enough through standard crew coordination." Morrison stepped forward, his tone professionally diplomatic but firmly resistant. "Jackson, I appreciate your terrain knowledge, but I've been flying Black Hawks for 15 years. I don't need someone else making control decisions during critical phases of flight. Sir, I'm not questioning your piloting skills, but this approach requires specific techniques for mountain flying that aren't covered in standard military training. The timing sequences are different, the control inputs are counterintuitive, and the safety margins are completely different from conventional operations. Are you suggesting I'm not qualified to fly this mission?" Morrison's voice carried a dangerous edge. "I'm suggesting that mountain flying in alpine conditions requires specialized training that most military pilots haven't received. It's not about general competence, it's about specific expertise for specific conditions." The tension in the command center was palpable as the conversation revealed fundamental disagreements about qualifications, authority, and risk assessment. While they debated crew assignments and command structure, radio reports continued documenting the deteriorating situation at Adlerhorst. Major Collins attempted to broker a solution. "What if we authorize Jackson as co-pilot under Morrison's command? That would provide access to her terrain knowledge while maintaining experienced leadership." "Sir, Black Hawk operations require qualified co-pilots with documented military flight hours," Reynolds objected. "Jackson's civilian training doesn't meet military co-pilot certification requirements." "Then what exactly are you proposing?" Thornfield asked, his patience clearly strained by the circular debate. Eliza took a deep breath. knowing that her next words would either open the door to the opportunity she'd prepared for or permanently close it. "Sir, I'm proposing that extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary solutions. I have the specific qualifications needed for this specific mission. I can accomplish what conventional approaches cannot, but only if I'm authorized to execute the mission according to the techniques I've trained for." "You're asking me to authorize an unauthorized pilot to lead a rescue mission using unauthorized techniques," Thornfield summarized bluntly. "Sir, I'm asking you to authorize the right pilot for the right mission when conventional wisdom has already failed 3 times. The command center fell silent except for the static of radio communications and the distant sound of helicopters returning from another aborted rescue attempt. Through the tactical display, they could see weather conditions continuing to deteriorate, shrinking the already narrow window for successful evacuation. At 1700 hours, German Alpine Rescue transmitted an update that crystallized the urgency of their situation. "Ramstein Command, we have multiple casualties requiring immediate medical evacuation. Current weather models show complete flight operations shut down by 1800 hours. If evacuation cannot be accomplished within the next 60 minutes, we will likely lose several critically injured civilians." 60 minutes. That was the mathematical deadline for 203 lives hanging in the balance while military protocols debated qualification requirements and command authority. Thornfield stared at the tactical display for a long moment, then turned back to Eliza. "Jackson, if I authorize this mission and you fail, I'll face court-martial for criminal negligence. If I don't authorize it and those civilians die, I'll face congressional investigation for failure to utilize available resources. Either way, my career is probably over." "Sir, my career has never really started because of decisions exactly like this one, but 203 people don't care about our careers. They care about someone being willing to try when others say it's impossible. And if you're wrong, if your approach doesn't work, or if conditions are worse than you predict, or if your training isn't sufficient for actual operations, then I'll have failed attempting to save lives rather than succeeded at doing nothing." The answer hung in the air like a challenge to the fundamental assumptions that governed military decision-making. Standard protocols existed to prevent disasters, but they also prevented innovation when innovation was desperately needed. Morrison stepped forward one final time. "Thornfield, I formally request to lead this mission with Jackson as terrain specialist. I'll take responsibility for flight operations while utilizing her local knowledge." "Sir, that compromise won't work," Eliza replied quietly. "The approach techniques I'm describing can't be communicated fast enough during critical flight phases. Either I fly this mission using the methods I've trained for, or we watch 203 people die while following proper procedures." The room fell silent as everyone understood the choice she was presenting. Military discipline versus desperate necessity. Proven procedures versus unproven innovation. Following orders versus following conscience. Outside, the sound of another helicopter returning from a failed rescue attempt served as a reminder. That time was running out for finding any solution that worked. Thornfield looked at his watch then, at the weather reports, then at the young pilot who was asking for the chance to prove that impossible wasn't permanent. "Jackson, if I authorize this, you'll fly alone. No crew, no backup, no support if things go wrong. Are you prepared for that level of responsibility?" "Sir, I've been preparing for exactly that level of responsibility for 18 months. At 1710 hours, Squadron Leader Thornfield made the decision that would either save 203 lives or destroy multiple military careers. The command center fell silent as he keyed his radio and issued an authorization that violated every standard protocol. For mission assignment and crew qualification, all units be advised that Flight Lieutenant Jackson is authorized for emergency rescue operations at Adlerhorst Resort. She will fly solo rescue mission using specialized approach techniques. All other aircraft are to maintain safe distance and provide communication support only. The radio crackled with responses that ranged from confusion to outright protest. German Alpine Rescue requested confirmation. Morrison formally objected to the irregular crew assignment. Chief Warrant Officer Reynolds questioned the legal authority for such an unprecedented decision. Through it all, Eliza felt a strange calm settling over her. After 18 months of preparation and weeks of doubt about her capabilities, she was finally being given the opportunity to prove that size didn't determine strength, that unconventional wisdom sometimes trumped conventional experience, and that the right pilot in the right situation could accomplish what others considered impossible. "Jackson, you have exactly 50 minutes before weather conditions ground all flight operations," Thornfield announced. "Your aircraft is fueled and pre-flighted. Your emergency medical team is standing by for casualty processing. And your commanding officer is about to explain to his superiors why he authorized an unqualified pilot for the most challenging rescue operation in this unit's history. Sir, thank you for giving me the chance to prove I'm not unqualified." As Eliza walked toward the flight line, she could hear continued debate in the command center behind her. Some officers were already calculating the damage to their careers if her mission failed. Others were documenting their objections to create distance from the decision. A few were quietly hoping that the young pilot they'd consistently underestimated might somehow pull off a miracle. Her Black Hawk sat on the tarmac like a mechanical promise of redemption. The aircraft she'd flown hundreds of times in training, thousands of times in her imagination, but never in conditions where failure meant death for over 200 people. Chief Maintenance Sergeant Torres approached as she conducted her pre-flight inspection. "Lieutenant, I configured your bird with maximum fuel load and emergency medical equipment," Torres reported. "But I have to ask, are you sure about this? That terrain would challenge pilots with twice your documented experience." "Sergeant, documented experience and actual experience aren't always the same thing. I'm as ready for this mission as I'll ever be." Torres studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I've watched you fly training exercises, ma'am. You handle aircraft like they're extensions of your own body. If anyone can thread the needle at Adlerhorst, it might be you." The endorsement from someone who understood aircraft operations meant more to Eliza than all the official qualifications in the world. She completed her pre-flight inspection, confirmed communication frequencies, and reviewed the approach plan she'd been visualizing for months. At 17:25 hours, she strapped herself into the pilot's seat and began engine start procedures. The familiar vibration of rotor blades beginning to turn seemed to synchronize with her heartbeat. This was the moment she'd been preparing for, not just for 18 months, but for her entire life. The radio crackled with final mission authorization. "Rescue 1, you are cleared for departure. Be advised that weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. You have approximately 40 minutes before conditions become unsurvivable for aircraft operations. Command, Rescue 1 departing Ramstein. Eta to Adlerhorst 35 minutes. Beginning approach preparation now." As the Black Hawk lifted off the tarmac, Eliza felt the weight of 203 lives settling onto her shoulders. Below her, she could see colleagues watching from the flight line, some with concern, others with skepticism, a few with something approaching hope. The flight to Adlerhorst took her over terrain she'd studied obsessively but never flown in actual rescue conditions. The alpine landscape unfolded beneath her like a three-dimensional map she'd memorized in extraordinary detail. Every ridge, every valley, every potential hazard was exactly where she'd expected it to be. But as she approached the disaster area, the reality of the situation became more daunting than any training scenario she'd experienced. The rockslide had completely altered the landscape around the resort. What had once been a challenging but manageable landing zone was now an apocalyptic scene of destruction that seemed to mock any attempt at conventional rescue. 3 German rescue helicopters circled at safe distance, their crews monitoring her approach with a mixture of professional curiosity and disbelief. Radio chatter indicated they'd given up on reaching the resort after multiple failed attempts, but they remained in the area to provide communication support and witness whatever was about to happen. Rescue 1, German Alpine Control. Be advised. We have attempted multiple approaches to your target location. Wind conditions are beyond safe operating parameters for conventional landing procedures. Alpine Control, Rescue 1. Understood. I'm not planning conventional landing procedures. As she closed distance to the resort, Eliza could see the full scope of the challenge ahead. The resort buildings perched on their narrow shelf looked like toys scattered by a giant's tantrum. Smoke rose from several structures, indicating possible fires from damaged heating systems. Most critically, she could see tiny figures moving around the buildings, some waving frantically at the approaching aircraft. 203 people, counting on her to accomplish what everyone else had declared impossible. At 17:55 hours. With weather conditions continuing to deteriorate and her fuel reserves calculating to minimum safe margins, Eliza began the approach that would either validate 18 months of preparation or end multiple lives in spectacular failure. Command. Rescue 1 beginning final approach. Implementing specialized mountain landing procedures. All other aircraft maintain safe distance. Rescue 1 Command. All personnel standing by for your success. Bring them home, Jackson. As she descended toward the resort, fighting wind shear that felt like invisible hands trying to tear her aircraft apart, Eliza realized that this was exactly where she belonged. Not in the safe comfort of logistics coordination, but here in the chaos and danger where unconventional solutions were the only solutions that worked. The point of no return wasn't just about altitude and fuel calculations. It was about proving that being underestimated was often the first step toward achieving the extraordinary. At 17:58 hours, as wind gusts reached 45 knots and visibility dropped to less than half a mile, Flight Lieutenant Eliza Jackson began the most technically challenging helicopter approach of her life. The conventional wisdom that had grounded 3 previous rescue attempts was about to face the ultimate test from someone whose expertise had been consistently overlooked. The key to her approach lay in understanding what other pilots had missed. The unique topography around Adlerhorst created predictable wind patterns that could be used rather than fought. While conventional approaches treated the mountain terrain as an obstacle, Eliza had learned to read it as a roadmap through the turbulence. Rescue 1 beginning descent through the primary wind corridor, she announced over the radio, her voice steady despite the aircraft's violent shaking. Using ridge-assisted descent protocol. Through her headset, she could hear German rescue coordinators providing real-time wind measurements that confirmed her calculations. The Venturi effect created by the narrow valley was generating exactly the pressure differential she'd studied during her civilian training. Instead of fighting against the downdrafts, she was using them to control her descent rate with surgical precision. At 800 feet above the resort, the first critical decision point arrived. The wind shear that had forced previous abort decisions was waiting like an invisible wall of turbulence. But Eliza had anticipated its location based on snow plume patterns she'd observed on the surrounding peaks. Now, she whispered to herself, executing a control input sequence that would have seemed counterintuitive to conventional pilots. Instead of applying power to fight through the turbulence, she reduced collective pitch and used the downdraft to accelerate her descent rate, timing the maneuver to catch the more stable air on the far side of the shear layer. The Black Hawk dropped like a controlled falling stone, its descent rate climbing to over 2,000 feet per minute before Eliza expertly arrested the dive just above the resort buildings. German rescue pilots watching from safe distance transmitted amazement at the precision of her execution. Incredible approach control, Rescue 1. How did you predict that wind behavior? Alpine control, when you understand the terrain, the wind. Patterns become predictable, preparing for landing sequence. The landing zone she'd identified, the maintenance area behind the resort buildings, became visible as she maneuvered into final approach position. It was exactly as she'd remembered from her civilian training, 53 meters at its widest point, surrounded by structures that would normally create dangerous rotor wash effects, but positioned in a location where the mountain's natural wind patterns provided stable air. At 200 feet, the second critical challenge emerged. The resort's position on its narrow shelf created a ground effect phenomenon that other pilots hadn't anticipated. As her rotor downwash reflected off the surrounding buildings, it created a cushion of compressed air that could either assist or complicate her landing, depending on how it was managed. Eliza had practiced this exact scenario during her Austrian training. Instead of fighting the ground effect, she used it to control her final descent rate, bleeding off forward airspeed while maintaining precise altitude control. The Black Hawk settled onto the improvised landing zone with a touchdown so gentle that debris barely stirred around the aircraft. Rescue 1 is on the ground at Adlerhorst Resort, she announced, the relief in her voice masked by professional composure. Beginning passenger evacuation procedures. The moment her skids touched down, resort personnel emerged from the buildings like survivors emerging from a bunker. The scene that greeted Eliza was worse than any briefing had suggested. Multiple serious injuries, exhausted medical staff, and structural damage that made the buildings increasingly unsafe as refuge areas. Dr. Sarah Weber, the resort's chief medical officer, ran toward the aircraft as Eliza shut down systems and prepared for passenger loading. Lieutenant, we have 17 priority medical evacuations and approximately 50 others who need immediate transport to lower altitude due to hypothermia risk. Doctor, how many can we safely load for this flight given weight and balance constraints? Based on the injured and medical equipment, maybe 25 maximum, but we have 203 people total. The mathematics were brutal but clear. Even with perfect execution, Eliza would need to make at least 8 round trips to evacuate everyone. With deteriorating weather conditions and limited fuel, the mission timeline was approaching impossible. Doctor, prioritize the most critical cases for immediate evacuation. I'll return for additional loads as conditions permit. As medical personnel loaded stretchers and walking wounded into her aircraft, Eliza recalculated fuel consumption and weather windows. Each round trip would take approximately 40 minutes, including loading and unloading time. Weather forecasts showed complete flight shutdown within 3 hours. The mathematics suggested she could evacuate perhaps 150 people before conditions became UNSU RVIVABLE. But she hadn't come this far to leave 50 people behind. At 1825 hours. With 24 evacuees loaded and secured, Eliza began her departure from Adlerhorst. The takeoff proved even more challenging than the landing, as the additional weight and shifting weather conditions required perfect execution of power management techniques she'd practiced hundreds of times but never under such pressure. Flight back to Ramstein took 38 minutes, during which she coordinated with medical teams for casualty processing and refueling crews for rapid turnaround. Radio communications buzzed with updates from colleagues who were monitoring her progress with a mixture of amazement and continued skepticism. Rescue 1, Command. Confirmed successful evacuation of first group. Medical teams standing by for casualty. Reception. Command, Rescue 1. 24 evacuees inbound, including 7 priority medical cases. Request immediate refuel and turnaround for second extraction. As she approached Ramstein for her first landing, Eliza realized that she'd crossed more than just the point of no return. She'd crossed the line from being an overlooked logistics coordinator to being the pilot, who was accomplishing what everyone else had declared impossible. The aircraft touched down at Ramstein at 19:03 hours, beginning a precisely choreographed ballet of casualty offloading, medical triage, aircraft refueling, and mission preparation that would repeat 7 more times before the weather window closed. But first, she had to prove that the initial success wasn't just lucked out by 1920 hours. She was airborne again, heading back into conditions that were continuing to deteriorate, while 179 people waited for someone willing to keep trying when common sense suggested it was time to quit. 6 months after the Adlerhorst rescue operation, Captain Eliza Jackson stood in the same briefing room where she had once been relegated to logistics coordination and dismissed suggestions, but everything had changed. The mountain rescue patch on her shoulder carried authority that her logistics insignia never had, and when she spoke, people listened with the respect reserved for someone who had redefined what was possible. The terrain analysis for Sector 15 indicates challenging but manageable conditions for our operation, she informed the assembled rescue team, pointing to topographical displays that had become her domain of expertise. The key is understanding the wind patterns created by this ridge formation. If we approach from the southwest, we can use the mountain's natural lift to assist our ascent. Major Williams, now her executive officer rather than her skeptical superior, nodded approvingly. Captain, what's your assessment of the weather window for this extraction? We have approximately 4 hours before the storm system moves in. That's sufficient time for primary evacuation, with safety margins for unexpected complications. The transformation in how others viewed her capabilities was remarkable, but the transformation in how the military approached unconventional expertise was revolutionary. The Adlerhorst incident had triggered a comprehensive review of qualification requirements, training recognition, and mission assignment protocols throughout European Joint Operations Command. General Sterling had implemented new procedures that required comprehensive skills assessment rather than purely institutional credentials. Civilian training was now evaluated for military relevance rather than automatically dismissed. Most importantly, commanders were authorized to utilize available expertise during emergency operations, without waiting for traditional qualification. Validation. Captain Jackson's case demonstrated that we were losing operational capability by failing to recognize relevant expertise. General Sterling had explained to the Military Aviation Review Board. Our new protocols ensure that qualification assessment matches mission requirements rather than bureaucratic convenience. The changes extended beyond policy modifications. The military had established formal partnerships with civilian mountain rescue organizations to provide specialized training for military pilots. Eliza had been appointed as the primary liaison for this program, designing curricula that combined military operational requirements with civilian mountain flying expertise. Influence reached far beyond European operations. Aviation commands in mountainous regions worldwide had requested consultation on developing specialized mountain rescue capabilities. The techniques she demonstrated at Adlerhorst were being taught at military flight schools as standard procedures. Rather than emergency improvisation, but perhaps the most significant change was cultural. The base that had once questioned her dedication to expanding her capabilities now encouraged all personnel to pursue additional training. Soldiers throughout the command were developing expertise beyond their assigned roles, creating a more versatile and capable military force. Lieutenant Morrison, who had initially opposed her mission assignment, approached her after the briefing with a request that symbolized how completely perceptions had shifted. Captain, I've enrolled in the civilian mountain flying program you recommended. I'd appreciate your guidance on developing those skills. The request from someone who had once questioned her qualifications demonstrated how success had transformed skeptics into supporters. But Eliza's response showed that her success hadn't changed her fundamental character. "Lieutenant, mountain flying is about understanding that conventional limitations are often just failures of imagination. I'll be happy to help you discover what you're actually capable of accomplishing." The rescue mission they were planning involved a climbing team trapped at high altitude in conditions that would have been declared impossible for helicopter operations 6 months earlier. Now, such missions were considered challenging but routine, a testament to how quickly the impossible could become the expected. When the right expertise was properly utilized, a team prepared for deployment. Eliza reflected on the journey that had brought her from overlooked logistics coordinator to recognized expert in mountain rescue operations. The institutional barriers she'd faced had been replaced by institutional support. The colleagues who had once dismissed her capabilities now sought her mentorship. The missions she'd been excluded from were now missions she designed and led. Dr. Weber, the medical officer from Adlerhorst Resort, had maintained contact throughout Eliza's transformation. Her most recent message captured the broader impact of that night in the Bavarian Alps. "Captain, you didn't just save 203 lives that night. You changed how the entire rescue community thinks about what's possible when expertise is properly recognized and utilized." The mission alarm sounded, indicating deployment time for the current rescue operation. Eliza shouldered her pack and headed toward her aircraft, not the same Black Hawk she'd flown that night, but a specially configured mountain rescue helicopter. Equipped with the latest navigation and safety equipment, her experience had helped design as her team assembled for final mission briefing. She noticed several new faces among the experienced crew members. Young pilots and medical personnel who had joined the unit specifically to work with the officer who had proven that being underestimated was often the first step toward achieving the extraordinary. "Team, today's mission involves terrain that would have been considered impossible for helicopter operations a year ago," Eliza announced as they walked toward their aircraft. "But we've learned that impossible is usually just another way of saying we haven't found the right approach yet." The helicopter lifted off into the alpine morning, carrying a crew that understood that conventional limitations were often just starting points for innovative solutions. As they flew toward another group of people who needed someone willing to attempt what others declared impossible, Eliza smiled at the irony of her transformation. She was no longer the tiny logistics coordinator who watched from the sidelines while others flew important missions. She was the mountain rescue specialist who had redefined what was possible in military aviation, proving that sometimes the most unlikely hero was exactly who you needed when conventional wisdom failed. The rescue site appeared ahead, another impossible location where impossible rescues had become routine. Just another day in the career of someone who had learned that the difference between impossible and inevitable was usually just a matter of proper preparation and the courage to try when others said it couldn't be done. As they began their approach to yet another landing zone that shouldn't have been possible, Eliza keyed her radio with the confidence of someone who had made a career out of proving that limitations were often just failures of imagination. "Alpine Control, Rescue 1, beginning approach to Impossible LZ. Estimated time to target achievement, 15 minutes. Because that's what happened when people stopped accepting limitations and started exceeding expectations, one impossible rescue at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.